Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well this week. We are continuing on now in our discussion, our exploration of Confucianism. Last week, I gave you kind of a brief introduction to this Asian philosophy, a little history of Confucianism and the historical figure of Master Kong, Confucius. This week, we're actually just going to explore some of the passages within the primary Confucian text, the Analects. And I probably should have explained this before, but just a little note moving forward in this class. When we look at texts that were written by the historical figures themselves or within the historical time period, we're dealing with primary texts. When we're looking at texts that are written about the topic or the person or the philosophy in question by somebody else, those are called secondary texts. So the structure that I'm trying to follow in this class is the first lecture that I give on an Asian philosophy is normally secondary. It is some sort of introduction or it's pulled from sources that are talking about the philosophy or the text or the person in question. And then the second week, just to give you all some experience actually reading the primary source material, we then look at a text that was written either by the founder of the philosophy or the religion, or their students, or some combination of both. So that's exactly what we're doing this week. We're going to look at a few different passages from only the first 5 books in the Analects. There are many more books than this within this collection of sayings and aphorisms, but there's only so much time and space to go over them. So even though I'm only going to go over uh, a select number of passages within the first 5 books, I would highly encourage you all to do your own research and continue to read and continue to try to interpret what Confucius and his disciples are saying. Okay, with that out of the way, let's begin. We'll start obviously by going over some of the important terms that you will have come across if you've started reading the text yourself. First is Ren, and this is one of the central values found within Confucianism that is going to pop up in a lot of the passages we're going to be looking at today. It is described by the author of the introduction to the version of the Analects that we're looking at as a comprehensive ethical virtue within Confucianism. It basically means humaneness or empathy. Remember, Confucianism, one of its central values is all about being able to empathize with other people so that you can occupy and perform your social roles and duties appropriately. This is what Ren is. Another term that we're going to see pop up a lot is Junzi, which means the ideally ethical and morally capable person. Literally, it means something like son of a prince, because typically these moral values and qualities were associated with aristocrats or the aristocratic character. So somebody who is a Junzi is somebody who has a morally upright character, who knows what goodness is, who knows what the good is, and who practices it, who is honest, generous, humane, just, etc. In Western philosophical terms, this would be the virtuous person, according to Aristotle. We also have the Tao. This is something that we're going to be investigating more within Taoism, but within Confucianism specifically, uh, the Tao is a teaching or way that is a key to some arena or process of action. So you can think of it as basically the technique or the art that you're going to apply in order to actualize the goals and the values of Confucianism. When we look at Taoism, however, the Tao is going to be interpreted much more metaphysically and loosely. So this definition of Tao is going to be uh, precise and a term of art for the specific teachings that we're looking at in this Asian philosophy. Later, we're going to modify this definition a little bit. We also have Li. Li is supposed to denote the ritual institutions and practices of the Zhou dynasty, which was the dynasty that you may have remembered from last lecture that ruled over China during a time that was peaceful and prosperous. That ended before the Warring States period, on the cusp of which Confucius was born and into which he was thrown, uh, which he developed Confucianism as a reaction to. So Li is supposed to represent the ways of life, the ways of thinking associated with this particular prosperous, peaceful historical time in Chinese history. Something that Confucius is trying to uh, bring the Chinese people back to and inculcate within them, because he sees this as being the solution to the socially and politically chaotic times that they are in. Li is also something that Confucius was trained and educated in. We also have Tien. I think I noted before that this is translated as heaven, or it's sometimes used to refer to God. Within the passages that we're going to be looking at today, this word is used to represent basically the moral order, or the ideal order, uh, what the transcendental realm of morality and goodness is like, what we're trying to model society after. Normally, the symbol used is the starry heavens when we think of this morally transcendent order that we're trying to um, embody and get society to mirror. And then finally, we have de, which is virtue. This is another kind of big, complex word within Confucianism, but it means something like self mastery and orientation towards moral action. And this is kind of the definition that we also see in Aristotle's virtue theory, which is the idea that if we want to become good people, morally upstanding people, junze, what we do is we cultivate certain habits and dispositions. We create a certain moral character that just thinks and acts in the proper ways. And then finally, we have when, which is literally pattern. This is supposed to be related to or associated with the Zhou civilizational practices. Um, what Confucianism is patterned on, basically, is the ways of thinking and being of this dynasty that Confucius was educated in. Okay, with that out of the way, let's now actually start looking at some of the passages. Again, we're only going to look at the first 5 books. There are a lot more than that in this text, so I would encourage y'all to read more of this if you do have time, because really we're only scratching the surface here with some of my interpretations. Keep in mind, I am not, a world expert on this stuff. I think I have a pretty good understanding of these Asian philosophies, but see if you can find additional meanings and useful interpretations. Think about some of this yourself too. And if you have any questions or concerns, of course, you can always email me or look up stuff on the internet as well towards your own education. Okay, let's begin. Passage 1 states, "The master said," and remember, the master or Master Kong, these are referring to Confucius, unless otherwise stated in a different passage, "to study and at due times practice what one has studied. Is this not a pleasure? When friends come from distant places, is this not joy? To remain unsoured when his talents are unrecognized, is this not a junze?" What I think Confucius is trying to get at here is basically that cultivating a proper moral character, study, and putting those ethical principles into practice, uh, this is a pleasurable activity. This is not going to guarantee, however, that people necessarily understand our way of life, that they approve of it all the time, that they find us a joy or a wonder to be around. We should not be upset if other people don't understand why it is that we're doing what we're doing, or why we're trying to chase after moral self betterment. Instead, we should not really be focusing on others and their actions. As we'll see also in Buddhism, the focus is mostly on the self. Not in a selfish way, but trying to better the self instead of endlessly judging and living according to other people's standards. Passage 2 says, Master Yu said, "It is rare to find a person who is filial to his parents and respectful of his elders, yet who likes to oppose his ruling superior. And never has there been one who does not like opposing his ruler who has raised a rebellion. The Junzi works on the root. Once the root is planted, the Tao is born." Filiality and respect for elders, are these not the roots of Ren or humaneness? What this passage is getting at, which was apparently espoused by Master Yu, who I believe was a disciple of Confucius, is basically that if you want to have an impact on somebody, if you want somebody to change for the better in a lasting way, if you want society to change for the better in a lasting way, what you need to do is you need to educate them properly in what morally and socially acceptable behavior is. If you want to ensure the smooth functioning of society, you need to develop people's characters so that they fit a particular mold. Confucius might say, so that they fit the Zhou mold, so that they follow the civilizational practices of the Zhou dynasty. So, we should work on developing our characters so that we think and act empathetically and lovingly, according to Ren. From this, once we get our own hearts in the right place, once we've established a good moral character, and other people have as well, then individual and social life will blossom and society will function smoothly. So, if somebody does have a proper respect for their elders, for their rulers, they're not going to usurp power, they're not going to start a rebellion. Everybody's going to know the social roles that they occupy, and they're going to carry out those roles appropriately. Section 8 in Book 1, or Passage 8, says, "The Master said, if a Junzi is not serious, he will not be held in awe. If you study, you will not be crude. Take loyalty and trustworthiness as the pivot, and have no friends who are not like yourself in this. If you err, do not be afraid to correct yourself." So I've just added a little clip art illustration of a pivot here. Um, Basically, what I think Confucius is trying to say here is that if you study his teachings appropriately, if you work on bettering yourself psychologically and morally, and if you associate yourself with people who are also engaged in this process of self-betterment, you're going to be a lot better off than other people who are chasing after worldly things, who are chasing after power and fame. We should always be reflecting on our own deficiencies, reflecting on how we can better occupy those social roles that we are supposed to embody, how we can better express filiality, reverence, empathy. All of these things are important, and they must be approached with the appropriate level of seriousness. If our own moral self development is not approached seriously, and if we don't show up in social interactions with the appropriate seriousness, that is going to prevent the smooth functioning of society, and it's going to prevent our own self improvement. So, what I have here is one must embody appropriate seriousness in their moral development and social interactions. We should associate with those who are considerate and trustworthy, right? You don't want to have relationships with people who are going to screw you over, who aren't dependable, who aren't honest. These people are going to make your life hell. In some small way, they're going to make society hell as well, right? So we should form appropriate relationships with people who are also working on themselves, and we should remain humble. This call to humility, this call to not being afraid to correct ourselves, is something that we're also going to see in Buddhism, in the virtue of heedfulness. The Buddha calls for people to be heedful, which means to be self-reflective, to uh, think about where they are on their spiritual path, how they might improve. All of this is stuff that we should be focused on rather than placing our attention on stuff out there, on external matters and affairs that don't really matter. Passage 9 says, Master Zhang said, devote care to life's end and pursue respect for the distant dead. In this way, the virtue of the people will return to fullness. This is an idea that we're seeing in Confucianism that is actually seeing something of a resurgence in contemporary self-help and psychological studies. The idea is something like the world would be better off if we thought about how our actions are going to impact others, how they're going to impact the future, how they're going to impact society. And the world would be better off if we actually thought about these things. If we actually tried to leave the world a better place than what we entered it when we were born. In some sense, and this is a big central value in Confucianism, we have some sort of moral obligation to our ancestors, to the dead. You will recall that in the last lecture, we saw that ancestor worship is something that is central to a lot of people who, central to the practice of a lot of people who follow Confucianism. Well, I think a similar idea is being evinced here. We have some sort of moral obligation or debt that we owe to both the dead and the unborn to better ourselves in society. Part of this involves not only recording our present cultural wisdom, but also carrying forth the wisdom that past generations have brought with them, embodying that wisdom, and teaching it to our children as well. So, one of the central ideas we're going to see in Confucianism is that there is a lot of truth and wisdom to be found in the old ways and traditions. Okay? This is not something that we really think about or embody nowadays. In contemporary Western society, we are rather progressively minded, and we think, oh, what did the boomers know? What did our grandparents know? They were backwards. They don't really know much of anything. We're so much more knowledgeable and kinder. Well, the truth isn't so black and white. Some people on the right, just as Confucianists are going to say, there is actually truth and wisdom to be found in the old ways and traditions. And we shouldn't just toss that stuff out. Instead, we should reflect on that stuff. And we should see if it can be useful in our present times. Passage 14 says, the master said, a junzi is not concerned that food fill his belly. He does not seek comfort in his residence. If a person is apt in conduct and cautious in speech, stays near those who keep to the Tao and corrects himself thereby, he may be said to love learning. Basically, what I get from this passage is that we need to prioritize certain things in our lives if we want to be fulfilled and happy. If we want society to function smoothly. One of those things is occupying our social roles properly and prioritizing our own moral cultivation over material stuff like wealth, fame, money, gadgets, etc. Another thing that this passage is getting across is that we should mind our speech. This isn't something that we tend to do nowadays. With access to digital technology and social media, everybody is constantly spewing stuff all the time. Maybe the world would be a better place if we thought about what we were going to say before we tweeted about it. So we should mind our speech. We should follow the example of those who are good and doing good. This is what is meant by stays near those who keep to the Tao and corrects himself thereby. And we should be trying to better ourselves constantly, trying to be a better son, daughter, brother, sister, parent, granddaughter, grandson, whatever it is. Again, we can view Confucianism as primarily a social political theory that is trying to establish a harmonious society. In order to do that, in order to play our role in that, we need to become the best versions of ourselves that we can, having proper respect for the traditions, ways, and elders in our society. Passage 16 says, "The master said, 'Do not be concerned that no one recognizes your merits. Be concerned that you may not recognize others' merits.'" Here again, we see another idea that is central to Confucianism and Buddhism. The idea that instead of endlessly focusing our attention on stuff outside of us, on what others are doing, on what others are thinking, we should worry first and foremost about our own self improvement, our own speech, our own actions, rather than trying to look good to everybody around us or trying to receive praise or rewards from society. These things don't really matter at the end of the day because Confucianism is going to say, if not imply, uh, like Buddhism, that a lot of our suffering and a lot of our flourishing is dependent on our outlook and our own mental and moral characters. That is what is going to be key in these two Asian philosophies that we look at. Let's now move to Book 2. Passage 3 says, "The master said, 'Guide them with policies and align them with punishments, and the people will evade them and have no shame. Guide them with virtue and align them with Li, and the people will have a sense of shame and fulfill their roles.'" I think this passage has to do with what proper social and political policy looks like, according to Confucianism. One way that you could run the country is by engaging in authoritarianism, pressing down on the people, trying to control their actions with laws and imprisonments and punishments. That's one thing that you could do. According to Confucius, this isn't really going to go over well with the people. The people will evade them and they'll have no shame. Rather, what we should be doing, if we want to establish long lasting change, according to Confucius, is changing people's hearts and minds at the individual level. Changing people's characters through proper education from the ground up, rather than trying to engage in top-down control. Think of a fountain. Let's compare the fountain to society. Let's say you're a ruler of your society, and you're trying to get the people to follow a certain principle, to behave a certain way. In our analogy, let's say dyeing the color of the water green. Okay, that's what you're trying to accomplish in the fountain. What is going to be a more efficient way of dyeing the water green? Is it pouring on dye from the top? Or is it at the roots of the fountain putting the dye in? Confucius is going to say we need to work at the roots. And so, if we want to produce long lasting social change, if we want to produce a prosperous, peaceful, functioning society, we need to make sure the people are properly educated instead of trying to control their actions with laws and punishments from the top down. Passage 7 says, Ziyu asked about filiality. The master said, "What is meant by filiality today is nothing but being able to take care of your parents. But even hounds and horses can require care. Without respectful vigilance, what is the difference?" Well, I think this is a worthwhile question. Basically, what I think Confucius is trying to get at here is your actions matter, but what matter perhaps more than your actions is your attitude, your heart posture. Doing good actions are not enough. You also have to change your outlook and do your actions with sincerity. You actually have to care about what you're doing. Respecting and taking care of your parents is something that is central to a lot of Asian cultures. But just cooking them food or helping them out isn't good enough, right? You should also do that with love and respect out of a desire to want to help and care for them, because that's presumably what they did with you when you were young. So, if you're going to follow Confucianism, you need to not just do the proper things, it's about affecting a sort of moral and psychological transformation within you so that you actually want to do the good stuff from the right space, from the proper mindset. I apologize, my cats are fighting. Let's move on to the next passage. Passage 11 states, "The master said, a person who can bring new warmth to the old while understanding the new is worthy to take as a teacher." I think this passage is trying to get at something that we looked at previously, which has to do with the old ways and the old traditions. Again, there is wisdom to be found in the old ways and the old traditions. This is exactly what Confucius would say with regards to the Zhou dynasty in relation to the Warring States period that he was in. But it's not good enough just to accept and follow all of these old traditions and outlooks. Again, we have to do that with the proper mindset, with the proper character, and we also have to try to figure out how we can apply and utilize that stuff relevant to the changing times that we are existing in. Society is not static, right? Society is always changing. So we need to kind of engage in a delicate balancing act of utilizing the wisdom and the traditions of people that came before us, and figuring out how we can apply them to the changing times that we are living in. We might liken society to a river. A river just is there, it's objective, it exists. Society is there, it's objective, it exists. It doesn't just disappear. But just as the river is always flowing, society is always changing. Therefore, we need to be reflecting on the old ways and traditions in order to kind of uh, strain the wisdom and the truth out of it so we can apply it to our present times. I think that's basically what this passage is trying to get across. Passage 14 states, "The master said, the Junzi is inclusive and not a partisan. The small man is a partisan and not inclusive." What is meant in this passage by small man is basically somebody who is petty, somebody who is not forgiving, who is not always morally upright. I think this passage is trying to express something about the character of the morally upright person. The morally upright person is someone who is properly open-minded with respect to both the new ways and traditions, or rather the new ways and the old traditions. Somebody who is not petty, who is allied with truth and goodness. Just as somebody who loves knowledge and loves the truth is going to look at all the different political positions, all the different philosophical positions, interrogate them, and draw the truth out. Likewise, the moral person isn't going to be allied with just one social group or just one government or just one society. Rather, they're going to be open to what goodness is, what truth is. They're going to look for it in all the different domains and aspects of the phenomenon in which they're investigating, and they're going to draw that out. The good person is not somebody who just follows democratic principles. The good person is not someone who just follows Republican principles or capitalistic principles or communistic principles or whatever it is. It's someone who actually follows the spirit of what is good. And I think we can say that there is truth and wisdom, at least a little bit, to be found in all of these different domains and philosophies. Passage 15 states, "The master said, if you study but don't reflect, you'll be lost. If you reflect but don't study, you'll get into trouble." And here again, we have another passage telling us what the proper attitude is that we should have with respect to Confucianism and being a good person. According to Confucius, we need to be both knowledgeable and put that knowledge into practice. It's not good enough just to study Confucianism or Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism, morality in general. We actually have to put that stuff into practice. Knowledge without putting that knowledge into practice isn't of much use. We should be trying to improve ourselves psychologically and morally through study, self-reflection, and putting that stuff into practice. If we just act without thinking about it, we're going to get in trouble. We might cause some trouble. So, study, that is a good education, self-reflection, and moral action are all really important. Passage 22 says, "The master said, a person without trustworthiness, who knows what he may do? A carriage without a yoke strap, a cart without a yoke hook. How can you drive these things?" What I think Confucius is trying to get at in this passage is that if we want to have a smooth functioning society, we need to have people who are trustworthy, dependable, and honest. If people are not trustworthy, dependable, and honest, that is going to lead to social disorder and political chaos, maybe violence, bloodshed, conflict. If we want to affect wide-scale social change, that is going to require the joint labor of several hands. We can compare this to Plato's conception of justice in his famous work, The Republic. In that book, Plato conceptualizes justice as everything being in its proper place, everything being prioritized, and everything being ordered properly. I think Confucius is getting at something similar here. If society is not properly ordered, if people are not showing up in their social roles properly, we're not going to be able to pull the cart of society. We're going to have oxen pulling in different directions. There's not going to be improvement. There's not going to be positive change. One of Plato's famous examples that he gives in the Republic is he says, even in a band of thieves, there needs to be some amount of justice. Because if the thieves just treat each other poorly all the time, if they're not at least somewhat just to each other, they wouldn't be able to pull off a heist. They wouldn't be able to engage in thieving activities together, pull off big scores, right? So, we're after justice. We're after order. We're after properly showing up in our social roles. Part of what that implies or requires is being trustworthy, dependable, honest. Let's now move to Book 3. Passage 3 in Book 3 says, "The master said, if a man is not Ren, humane, empathetic, what can he do with Li?" These practices, right? If a man is not Ren, what can he do with music? Again, I think this passage is trying to get across what use we are going to be to ourselves and to others if we have not cultivated the proper moral virtues. Empathy and understanding are required for following the positive old ways and traditions that Confucius was trying to get people to adhere to, right, of the Zhou dynasty. I think the question that he's asking here is, what value do our cultural practices and products have if they are not understood or practiced properly? He relates this specifically to music, which was part and parcel of a lot of different ritualistic practices, in reverence for the dead, in funerals, in social interactions at court, and so on and so forth. We might ask ourselves the same question. If we don't actually have a good understanding and properly engage in our cultural practices, what value do they really have for ourselves and others? Well, it's something worth meditating on. Passage 7 says, "The master said, the Junze does not compete, yet there is always archery, is there not? They mount the die bowing and yielding. They descend and toast one another. They compete at being Junzes." I like this passage. I think this one is really interesting. What he's trying to get at here by mentioning archery is archery in relation to some of the ritualistic practices that he's trying to get the Chinese people to embody again. What I think he's saying is that, again, material things don't matter nearly as much as uh, attaining, cultivating the proper character, the proper reverence, the proper empathy for others. Okay? If there is to be competition, if we think about this in a competition sense, it should be in relation to goodness. We should compete in trying to be the best versions of ourselves rather than just, trying to be the best bowler or the best mathematician or something like that. And that comes out of a place of pride, that comes out of a place of trying to one up one another in these ways that don't matter. What this passage reminds me of is actually the word for sin in Greek, which is hamartia. This literally means uh, whether or not you hit the mark. In early Christian traditions, this is how sin was conceptualized. If you sinned, it meant you didn't hit the mark appropriately. We might say something similar about archery and about Confucianism. Uh, if you are not occupying your social role properly, if you're not being properly empathetic and just and morally upright, you're not hitting that mark that you're after. Something worth meditating on. Passage 13 says, Wang Sun Jia asked, "What is the sense of that saying? Better to appeal to the kitchen god than the god of the dark corner." The master said, "Not so. If one offends against Tien, one will have no place at which to pray." Now, the note on this in the text is really important. Basically, what this official is asking Confucius is, you seem to be the one to be able to make society better rather than this other official. And he's using this analogy of appealing to the kitchen god rather than the god of the dark corner in order to meet your desired ends. But Confucius says, in a strange way, kind of refusing this analogy, not so. If one offends against Tien, one will have no place at which to pray. And what I think he's saying here is that the path to individual and social harmony, redemption, and flourishing follows not any individual person, but rather the order of heaven, the transcendental realm of what is good and what is right. That's what we should be looking towards in order to be a good person, in order to be empathetic, in order to be at peace. We shouldn't look to any individual. We should look at, what is that individual trying to embody? What moral order, what heavenly order are they appealing to or trying to reflect? That is what we should be looking towards. The spirit of morality and goodness, not the individual person. But if you have another interpretation of this, I'd love to see it in y'all's discussion posts. Moving on to Book 4, Passage 2 states, "The master said, those who are not Ren cannot long dwell in straitened circumstances, and cannot long dwell in joy." The Ren person is at peace with Ren. The wise person makes use of Ren. I think this passage is pretty straightforward. What I think it's trying to get across is that You're not going to be able to have an individual, peaceful, and happy life. You're not going to be able to have a flourishing society unless the people are Ren, unless they are embodying empathy and love for others. If you have people doing that, joy, peace, flourishing will follow. Individual and social life will not suffer if everyone is oriented towards Ren. Instead, if people are oriented towards material things, power, fame, wealth, that's when you're going to start to get into trouble. Passage 5 in Book 4 states, and this is only the latter half of the passage, if one takes Ren away from a Junzi, wherein is he worthy of the name? There is no interval so short that the Junzi deviates from Ren. Though rushing full tilt, it is there. Though head over heels, it is there. I think this passage is also trying to express to us what the proper character of somebody who is morally upright looks like. You cannot take goodness away from the person who is actually morally upright, right? If you're looking at someone and it looks like they're doing all these bad things and they're not being empathetic and they're not being kind, they're not being honest, what that reveals is they're not actually a morally upright person. Okay? When we proceed on the path to moral self betterment, whether it be following Buddhism or Confucianism, what that is going to involve is a process of moral and psychological transformation. The good person is somebody who is transformed. Okay? Somebody in Christian terms who does repent of their actions, who doesn't turn back to them and engage in them. Moral goodness cannot be taken away from somebody who is good, somebody who has worked at it and undergone a true transformation. We might say, in some sense, that somebody who still does engage in bad things, in dishonesty, in murder, in lust, that person is not actually transformed. That person is, according to Confucius, not actually a son of a prince. Passage 9 in Book 4 states, the master said, if a gentleman, she, sets his heart on the Tao, but is ashamed to wear poor clothes and eat poor food, he is not worth engaging in serious discussion. Here again, we see what a properly moral character or a gentleman, she, actually looks like. And how we should judge others. Somebody who sets his heart on the Tao, but is ashamed to wear poor clothes and eat poor food, does not have their priorities in the right place. Rather, if you actually care about moral self-improvement, if you actually care about transforming yourself and transforming society for the good, you're not going to care about this material stuff. Okay? And so we should not judge others based on their material circumstances. We shouldn't judge others based on their family name, the family that they were born into, their social or economic class, their race. Instead, Confucius is saying we should judge people based on their moral character and their moral achievements. That's what we should care about. And that's how we should also judge ourselves. We should be focusing on bettering ourselves and trying to better other people rather than chase after wealthy clothes, the most extravagant food, etc. Passage 14 states, the master said, do not be concerned that you have no position. Be concerned that you have what it takes to merit a position. Do not be concerned that no one recognizes you. Seek that which is worthy of recognition. This passage, I think, is echoing something that we just saw in the last passage. Again, The path to spiritual fulfillment, and for Confucianism, the path to social cohesion and harmony, lies not in the material things of this world, but in psychological, moral, and spiritual transformation. If you wanted to extend the meaning of this passage, we could also say, don't be concerned that you don't have money, wealth, or power. Be concerned that you have what it takes to merit those things. Do not, or maybe skill, maybe the proper outlook. Do not be concerned that no one recognizes you as important or wonderful or whatever. Seek that which is worthy of recognition. Seek out that virtuous moral character. Seek out wisdom and knowledge. Seek out kindness and love. Passage 18 states, the master said, when one has several times urged one's parents, observe their intentions. If they are not inclined to follow your urgings, maintain respectfulness and do not disobey. Labor on their behalf and bear no complaint. What Confucius is advocating for here, a certain version of respect for your parents, is something that is a little bit foreign to our Western ears. Nowadays, we don't tend to view our parents with the same respect that a lot of Asian cultures do. We do not really see their happiness as our responsibility, their well-being as much of our responsibility in the United States. Instead, we tend to argue with our parents. Maybe we cut them off. Maybe we don't even really speak to them. Maybe we don't give them the time of day. This is not what Confucius is going to advocate for. This is not what filiality actually looks like. When it comes to dealing with our parents, what I think this passage is saying is we should eschew conflict. This is a noble and wise course when dealing with our elders. Even if our parents are wrong, we shouldn't attempt to control them. We shouldn't attempt to force them into changing their minds or changing their ways. Oftentimes, trying to do that, trying to engage in a top-down strategy of control, is not going to change anything, right? When you try to force somebody to change or see your perspective, that ends up producing resistance, right? Trying to do this might backfire on you. So don't seek after conflict. Don't try to force them into changing. Instead, practice respect, practice obedience, according to Confucius, practice patience. If you want them to change, if you think you know better, that is actually the way to get them to change, rather than trying to force them into thinking or doing something differently. Passage 23 says, the master said, rarely has anyone missed the mark through self-constraint. I think this is a wise saying given our times in which we are rather apt to engage in overconsumption, drugs, alcohol, promiscuity, you might even say. If we actually had self-discipline and self-mastery, self-control, that would prevent us from getting into a lot of trouble. Instead of just giving into our desires, instead of just giving into our urges and our impulses, it might be more wise to think before we act and cultivate, according to Confucius, some self-mastery, some self-discipline. Rarely have people who have done this miss the mark. Let's now move on to Book 5. Passage 5 states, someone said, Yang is Ren, but he has no craft in speech. The master said, of what use is craft in speech? Those who parry others with glib tongues are frequent objects of detestation. I don't know whether Yang is Ren, but of what use is craft in speech? Here I think Confucius is speaking out against something that Plato and a lot of ancient Greek philosophers in the West have actually spoken out against, which I'm going to call rhetoric. Being able to masterfully employ language and words in order to achieve your desired ends. This is basically what rhetoric is. Defined by Aristotle as uh, art or skill in matters of persuasion. Confucius is saying, I mean, what use is this? Often people who are masters of speech do use this skill for nefarious purposes, right? Just think of politicians who can twist words to get what they want. Think of narcissistic people or abusive people who can twist your words against you to make you do what they want, right? Skill in rhetoric is not necessarily a virtue. You can imagine that people use it for all sorts of wrong reasons: flattery, lying, manipulation, whatever. Confucius is echoing a position on uh, craft and speech, rhetoric, that Plato actually discusses in his Republic a lot, which is philosophy or love of wisdom is always preferable and better than rhetoric, being able to use words to persuade people. Because truth is what matters. Truth is what's important, not manipulation. I think Confucius is saying something similar here. Passage 11 states, "The master said, I have never seen anyone who was incorruptible." Someone replied by mentioning Shen Chang. The master said, "Chang is full of desires. How could he be called incorruptible?" And this is a very interesting passage because I think we can connect it to the next Asian philosophy that we're going to look at in this class, Buddhism. Buddhism is also going to say that our desires, our attachments to the things of this world can lead us astray. Confucius, I think, is echoing the same sentiment. If you have desires, if you have worldly goals, those things can lead you astray, right? We must be vigilant in our journey to self improvement, to moral betterment, to real transformation. If we become complacent, if we start giving into our desires, our attachments, our impulses, that can lead us into trouble. That can lead us to backtracking, to undoing some of the progress that we have achieved. Passage 14 says, when Zilu had heard something new and had not yet learned to practice it, his only fear was that he would hear something else new. I like this passage. I think this one is interesting as well. What I think Confucius is trying to get across here, or rather Confucianism, is that self-betterment requires us to focus our attention on that process. It says, when Zilu heard something new and had not yet learned to practice it, his only fear was that he would hear something else new. Why? Well, let's imagine you heard something that you think is really valuable and you wanted to put it into practice. If you're really intent on that, if you really want to better yourself, you better meditate on that and put that into practice before you get distracted by other things, right? If our minds are divided or if they're distracted, we can't hope to get much done on this process to self-betterment or social harmony, which Confucianism is trying to establish here. We might compare this with the practice of prayer in other religious disciplines. Prayer isn't just about asking God for stuff. It's not just about praising God. Prayer also has to do with focusing our attention on the object of our prayer, whether that's God, whether that's the fulfillment of some project or goal. Prayer involves focusing our attention on what is important and transcendent to us. Something similar is going on when we are trying to engage in this process of self-betterment. We should be focused on something that is transcendent to us, this moral ideal, this order that within Confucianism is present within this transcendental realm, the starry heaven. We should be focused on that. We should have our attention fixed on that rather than letting our attention be divided a bunch of other things, whether that's drugs, alcohol, television, music, whatever. Which is not to say that we can't have fun in this life, but it depends on what our goals are. If our goals are happiness, peace, spiritual fulfillment, social cohesion, we should be focusing on maybe these moral values rather than just on the satisfaction of our desires. I think I have an extra slide here. Okay. I'd like to just end now on going over some questions that I think would be useful for y'all to ponder. Uh, Questions that I think you should reflect on if you're trying to come to a better understanding of Confucianism, um, a better understanding of yourself, perhaps, and if you also want to engage in this process of moral self cultivation, of moral, psychological, perhaps spiritual transformation. First of all, have you become convinced that there is truth and wisdom to be found in the old ways and traditions, like Confucius advocates for? What do you think about the value of respecting your elders, of obeying your parents? You think that's something that's good, something that ought to be followed? I would encourage y'all to think about what old values and traditions have to offer us in today's day and age. I don't think they're completely useless or wrong. I think instead, perhaps, if we treated social interactions with those who are older than us as opportunities to learn something new rather than dunk on them, that we might all be better off. Something worth thinking about. Secondly, how important do you think self betterment is for your own psychological and spiritual fulfillment? As we'll see in Confucianism and Buddhism, as well as a lot of Western ethical theories and philosophies of life, in order to find peace and joy, a lot of these thinkers are going to emphasize that we need to transform our hearts and transform our minds and become better people, become more loving people. Are you convinced of that? Do you think that your happiness depends in some sense on that? Or do you think you'd be happy and fulfilled just satisfying one desire after the other? What do you feel in your heart is going to allow you to be fulfilled? If you haven't meditated on that before, now is a good time to do so. And finally, what are some things you can change today to become a happier, more peaceful, and more loving person, provided you do want to become such a person? Are there little things that you could change in your life uh, to progress yourself along this path or set you on the path? How's your sleep schedule? How's your diet? Uh, how are you treating your friends and your family members? Do you approach them with love and empathy, and are you trying to understand them? Or are you living kind of a more selfish existence? Are you trying to learn more about the world, or are you just trying to get high? Well, these are things to think about. Think about what is going to be good and healthy for you in the long term. It's what Confucius is prompting us to do. He thinks following these traditions, occupying our social roles properly, is what's going to be able to get us there. But you might disagree. If you do, I'd love to hear about it in your discussion posts. Okay. Well, I think that's basically all I have for you today. I would encourage you all to continue reading the Analects. Of course, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to email me. Otherwise, I will see you next week as we jump into our next unit of investigating a different Asian philosophy. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good one.